This is primarily going to be about consciousness, but it'll touch on things from the first presentation. All right, again, this is the main screen. These are all the things included in the Rosetta Stone of Psychology. Lots of different things. No, that's what it was. I wanted to show that's the logo for the Rosetta Stone. In the background, that black and white fuzzy thing is a copy of the Rosetta Stone, and it relates to emotive energy. That is the Rosetta Stone of Psychology, and it includes information about the brain too. Okay, so earlier we talked in the first presentation about all of these things and talked about physics and talked about humanism and Maslow's pecking order. We talked about behaviorism and reinforcement. We talked about perceptual control system, which is control systems in general, like a thermostat. And we touched upon consciousness and neuroscience in the first presentation. Now, first thing to realize about consciousness is that breathing, digestion, your heart beating, these are all automagic. When you have something to eat, you don't tell your stomach, okay, I want you to squish now. Squeeze, squish, squeeze, squish. You don't have any conscious control over how your stomach works. And for the most part, you don't do that for your lungs or heart. You can hold your breath for a while, but pretty soon either you're going to pass out or you're going to realize you need to take a breath, and then you basically turn it over to the auto magic system. And so these are not under conscious control, even though they're affected by your conscious thoughts. If you get scared and it's based on what you're thinking, oh, what if this is going to happen? And you start getting nervous. Well, then it will affect your heart rate. It'll affect your breathing, things of that nature. So, though the heart, blood, lungs, stomach are not typically under conscious control, your thoughts do affect them. All right. Now, because these are internal to your body, rather than call this stuff the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what neuroscientists call it, I prefer calling it the internal control system, because that's all that we just were talking about, your heart, lungs, and stomach, that you don't use your mind to control. They run by themselves, they're auto magic. So that's the internal control system. And the other system that's not the heart, lungs, stomach, and a whole bunch of other stuff, these would be the external control systems. So rather than those ugly terms, sympathetic and parasympathetics, which tell you nothing about what they do, these two terms explain exactly what the systems do. The internal control system handles everything inside your body, and the external control system relates to all the things that you try and do in the outside world, things outside of your body. And those are the two fundamental parts for emotive energy, this model. Now, the other things that are in the external control system are all your senses. Touch, that's stuff you touch on the outside. Taste, those are things from the outside you put in your mouth. Hearing, those are waves vibrations in the air that are caused by other things and the noises. So you're sensing noises in the outside world. Smelling, you're sampling the air from the outside world. Does it smell like flowers or does it smell like stinky stuff? I mean, sampling the air around you for odors, and it's a chemical sense. And finally, vision, which is probably our primary sensing organ. That's to look at the the various images coming in, and those are light waves. What you see is a color, like if it's black, that means the black is absorbing all of the light. And so what gets reflected is black. If you see red, that's the only color that's not being absorbed, that's being reflected. If you see green, that's the only color that is not being absorbed. So we're seeing with our eyes the colors that are being reflected and bounced off from sunlight, which we consider pure light, even though it's not. So there's the external control system, all of your senses, touch, taste, smell, vision, hearing. And on the left side, the internal control system, those are things that you don't control with your mind. So those are the two major systems of life. Now, consciousness is part of the external control system, and it's a defense system. And it's a defense system because the external world is a dangerous place. Driving down the street, people have accidents all the time. We have accidents in the home. Some of the accidents can be very severe. Then some are minor, but they're annoying. I mean, you can get paper cuts. So, yeah, there are things all around us that we have to be wary of, that we need to worry about, and make sure we avoid those dangers that are constantly around us. So, the external system, yes, we manipulate because we need things from the external system. We need food, we need air, we need water, we need to get things. But nonetheless, uh, it's also important for us to be wary. Once we're dealing with the external world, there are dangers. Okay, strangely enough, sleep is the ideal state of the body, and that's when the automatic systems have taken over. While we're sleeping, we don't worry about heart rate, we don't worry about breathing, we don't worry about uh, any of the internal factors, our stomach, digestion. And the internal control system, phrase that's commonly used for it is rest and digest. And that's what's going on here. When we're sleeping, we're resting and digesting. And with no thinking or conscious thoughts being involved. Now, this state is called by uh, psychologists and probably neuroscientists, it's called homeostasis, which means it's balance. So up in the left-hand corner, the internal control system, underneath in parentheses, is the word balance. And the external control system, in contrast, is an imbalanced state. So homeostasis has been broken. So balance is probably the best term to use for these states. One is balanced and the other is imbalanced. The internal control system, that works to get your body balanced. Now, so the internal control system is in control when you're asleep or knocked out or when you're in a coma. And that is a state where you are not conscious. Now, the external control system, you are awake, you are alert, and again, it's a dangerous place, so you are vigilant. These are all aspects of consciousness. And though you don't recognize it necessarily, it's a stress state. And I'm not sure if we're going to get into, yeah, I think we're going to get into the stress state. Yes, this is why being conscious is a stress state. There's sleep deprivation studies in 1989 by Rechtschaffen, Everson, and Bergmann, and they used these poor little rats, and they wouldn't let them sleep, not at all. Wake up, wake up. And after about half a month or a month, those poor little rats would die. And it happened over and over and over again.
They actually did die?
Yeah,
Really?
yeah, from
From
lack of sleep.
tormenting them, from tormenting the poor things?
Well, it's not necessarily for tormenting, though. That's part of the problem, but it's because they were unable to sleep.
That's
Yeah,
tormenting them if they're poking
well,
them.
yeah, I guess it is. I'm not sure what they were doing with little needles or playing rock and roll music, whatever. So,
Poor things.
yeah, poor little things, but they all died for lack of sleep. And so their conclusion was sleep deprivation is deadly. Now, Carol Everson, all throughout the study, kept saying and asking, well, what killed the rats? And Rechtschaffen would say, well, that's not part of the study. She said, but what killed them? So she got her buddy, Linda Toth, and they redid the study, completely redid the study, specifically to find out what killed the rats. And so their plan was now, when the rats died, they would do an autopsy. And when they did the autopsy, they found that there was some pathogen, typically some bacterial infection in the bodies of the rats, and it eventually killed them. But it wasn't the same pathogen. Each time they found some different thing that caused the demise of the rats. And what's important about that is we have what's called an immune system, and that's supposed to defend our bodies against these pathogens that get inside our bodies. So since the pathogen was non-specific, Everson and Toth finally came to the conclusion, and they called it host defense. Our data indicated paired host defense. So host defense is the immune system. So the immune system was degraded, compromised, it failed, impaired, whatever you want to call it. It just wasn't working. So that says that if you don't get enough sleep, you open yourself up to disease and so forth. And a lot of times cancer is the result of folks who have abused their bodies, and the abuse has impacted the immune system. And basically, what's being said here is if you're awake, your immune system is not working at its optimum level. The optimum level for your immune system requires sleep. And that's why when we're sick, typically one of the things we want to do is we want to go to sleep. Your body is saying you need the immune system to work at its top level, and the top level is when you're asleep. Now, so this study with using rats, is that true for humans? Well, you bet. There's a disease called fatal familial insomnia, and that's when humans afflicted by this, they can't sleep, and eventually they'll die. And it's usually a longer period of time, maybe months. And if it's not a severe case, it might be accumulative over numerous years, but it also causes death. If we don't sleep, we'll die. Okay, so again, the internal control system, sleep, is the ideal state of the body, and that's when your immune system is working at its top level. It's working strongly. It's homeostasis and it's balance. Okay, it's optimum. Sleep is optimum for immune system. And that's where a coma is an example. The, during a coma, your external control system, your consciousness is completely shut down because the internal control system says, hey, we got to work on our problems internally. We don't have time to play games or go to work or do anything else. Okay. Now, another term for the parasympathetic system, which is the internal control system, is rest and digest. And another term for the sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight. And now these represent the value scale. This is presented in last week's presentation. That the things that we need, like rest and digest, those are positive, and it's hard to see in the diagram, but on the bottom, under to the left end, the green end of the value scale, are the words like. These are things we like, these are things we want, and these are things that we seek. And on the right, these are things that we dislike, we fear, and we avoid. And those are things that the fight or flight falls into, avoidance system, sympathetic nervous system. But there are things in the middle that we just don't care about. So we don't seek them because they have no benefit or attraction to us, and they have no threats to us. So we just don't care about them. So that's marked in the middle in black as neutral. We don't care and we ignore these things. Now, in last week's presentation, looking at B.F. Skinner, there are things that we work to achieve and other things that we work to avoid. So the extremes in last week's presentations about extremes. So things that we really need, we go after with high energy, and things that we really are fearful of, we avoid with a lot of energy. But everything is not the same, and as a result, sometimes we can do what we need with just a very low level of energy. Like for breathing, I mean, you don't go crazy. Oh, you got to breathe now. Well, if there is something in interrupting your breathing, like you're choking or something, it suddenly gets important. But for the most part, there's a lot of the things that we need that are the most important things in life that we really don't have to work very hard to get. And air is a classic example. And things like water, it's pretty ubiquitous. We typically don't have difficulty finding water. Food, though, it's a little more cost to that because it's expensive and we rely on other people. So there are varying levels of energy that we spend. And in the earlier presentation, I referred to the parasympathetic nervous system as drive gear. If you want something to eat, you drive your little body to the kitchen and you open the refrigerator or grab a box of something. And sympathetic nervous system, that's like swerve gear. As you're going to the kitchen, you swerve around the furniture, you swerve around the door jambs and so forth, and you avoid the things that are in your path. So you can look at those two systems as drive gear and swerve gear. Well, the somatic nervous system is the gas pedal. As you're driving your little body to the kitchen, you can go, at a leisurely pace. But if you're driving your little body to the bathroom, you might speed up a little bit. It might be more of an urgent issue. So you have that under your control, but the gas pedal is used for both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. Okay. Now, in the first presentation, I presented this idea from Elizabeth Duffy, a researcher. She said the difference between emotion and non-emotion, basically there's no clear difference can be made. They're both on the scale of emotion, and the activation occurs in a continuum from a very low degree to a very high degree. And that was what the somatic nervous system is, and that's what's shown over on the left in that part of the diagram. The gas pedal goes from a very low degree up to a very high degree. Now, Victor S. Johnston agrees with that. He says the most important characteristic of all feelings, emotions, as well as effects, he calls some things emotional and some things are just feelings, and so he calls those effects. And the important characteristic is that they both come in two different, and he calls them hedonic tones. They come as positive and negative tones. So he calls them a tone. Now, for the somatic system, now we go to Antonio Damasio down at the bottom in his book, The Feeling of What Happens. And Victor Johnston's book was Why We Feel. But Antonio Damasio, in his book, The Feeling of What Happens, he says emotion is integral to the process of reasoning. Patients who have lost a certain class of emotions also have lost their ability to make rational decisions. And he calls it his somatic marker hypothesis. And then I've changed, as you saw earlier, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is a useless term, doesn't tell you anything about what it relates to. It's really internal balance. It's the internal control system. And the sympathetic nervous system, the red system, is actually the external control system. And that basically is what consciousness is all about. When we're conscious, we can deal with the external world. When we're asleep, we can't. So consciousness is part of the external control system. And as noted with the rats, the internal control system, sleep, is balance. And with the external control system, it's an imbalanced state. And if you're denied sleep, eventually it'll kill you. All right, so how do we make decisions? Well, first of all, back to Maslow, humanism, he had his hierarchy of wants and needs. And the colors, the tallest column, the red one, is life. We seek life, and it's the most important thing that we seek. Next to it, with the dollar signs, the gold column is we need resources. We need, home and shelter, clothes, and so forth. Again, the external environment is hostile, so we need resources to protect us from those things. And in today's world, those resources typically cost money. So that's the next highest column. Then the middle yellow column is social needs. Maslow called those love needs, and so there's a heart there, but it's actually people that we benefit from, and it includes our friends, family, spouse. These are all things that These are all people needs, basically. So there's social needs. The green column, that relates to our confidence. He calls it esteem name, but esteem, what does that really mean? Well, confidence, people understand confidence. I think I can do it. I have confidence that I can get it done. And we want to have our confidence grow. So there's an up arrow. And finally, there's a star. It's a weird term by Maslow. It's called self-actualization. He borrowed it from somebody else named Kurt Goldstein, I think. But the self-actualization is what we're really good at. What are we proud of? What we resonate the most with. And so I'm calling it our star power. And finally, these all have energy. They all have physical energy. They have a power based on them, and it's a pecking level. Maslow's hierarchy is a pecking level. Life is more important than having money. Money, well, to some extent, resources are needed more than having people around us. There are hermits who live out in the real uh, wilds of the earth, and they survive because there are natural resources, and if they know how to use them, they can survive in the wild. But it's a lot easier to survive if we've got people helping us, and so it's tough to separate those two columns. But using his hierarchy, he's got the resources higher than people needs, and the same thing. There's a blur between people names, the yellow column, and confidence. I mean, if you have no confidence, if you've got a family to help you out, well, then suddenly you can survive, even if you have no confidence. You want your confidence to go up, but having people to help you survive is more important than your being confident in your own abilities. And then finally, your star power. Uh, that's the least important of all of those items, and is a pecking order as a result. And the pecking order is based on power. The desire for life is much more powerful than the desire for money. There was a ship that sank in 1857 in a hurricane, and it was carrying gold shipments from California. And a lot of the passengers had money belts on them. And when the ship was sinking, they threw their money belts into the ocean because it was no use to save them from drowning. In fact, it would cause them to drown. So they realized that, and they threw their money belts overboard, and they floated in the water, hoping to get picked up by one of the uh, the the ships that came to save people, and also the the lifeboats. Okay, so it's a pecking order, and each level has a power involved. So power is very important to all of these. Now, that is true for both the internal control system and the external control system. They both are powerful, and that is most clearly shown with the most important thing that we need for life is air. You can go days, maybe weeks without food, maybe not 2 weeks, but certainly days without food. And for water, you're going to need it more often. Maybe a day or two, you might be able to go without water, not much longer. But air, you've only got seconds, at most a minute or two. So air is a critical need for us to survive. And so that is the pecking order, even within life. Life, you need air, water, and food. but there's a pecking order even in that column, the red column. Air comes first, water comes next, and then food comes third. So all of these columns, there's a pecking order. Now, just as they're all the things that we need and want on the left, there are opposite things on the right. We want life, but we don't want death. So they're opposite, and they are of equal power. We want life just as much as we want to avoid death. And we want resources just as much as we want to avoid the lack of resources. And we want people in our life equally to being alone or have our heart broken. And we want our confidence to go up rather than go down. And finally, that star power. We don't want our star power to fade. We don't want to be a statistic. We want to be someone. We want to be special. All right. Now, so for decisions, over there on the right in blue, making decisions, how do these various needs and wants come up with an answer? And it's based on competition. An idea corresponds to a coalition of neurons. Of course, neurons are the little cells in our brains that make up our brain, and they work together. And a coalition is a group of the neurons working together, and it's clear that a winner take all competition plays a key role. That's Christoph Koch, Koch, neuroscientist. All right. So again, it's a power level. And that's what the competition is all about. The ideas, the coalition of ideas that has the most power behind it takes control. And sometimes we do that in our mind, looking at the pros and cons. Well, this automobile really has everything we need. It's got air conditioning and it's got heat, but it's purple. And I'm not wild about a purple car. And this other one, it has everything we need, and it's white. Well, white's okay. And there's another color that I'm looking at, blue. I kind of like blue. So we weigh these things in our mind by pros and cons. So that's a case where we're building a coalition of ideas, a coalition of neurons to help us make a decision. And the group, the coalition that has the most power to it, the most energy, is the one that will win the competition. And with food, we usually see that in a restaurant, reading the menu. Well, what would I like to have for dinner? Well, I like steak, but that's awfully expensive. And I'm on a diet, so I better go with chicken. So those are things that go into making decisions. All right, well, let's get in a little deeper. So we talked about the somatic nervous system. Well, that's what Antonio Damasio says is a key element in making a decision. He calls it the somatic marker. The somatic marker indicates how much power is being used in one of the columns or one of the ideas. And similarly, Victor S. Johnston, biologist, he calls it a hedonic tone, and he refers to it as a barometric. So that's basically what the somatic system is an indicator of. It's a barometric reference of something that goes higher or lower. So he calls it hedonic tone. And then within my system, emotive energy, I call it a motive trace. And that's where the term emotive energy comes from. It's the emotional energy involved that creates a decision. Now, I use the word trace because it was also the term used by Donald Olding Hebb in 1949, and it's called Hebb's Law. And basically, what it says is that this is pretty convoluted. When an axon of a cell A, basically, there's part of a neuron cell called an axon. And an axon stretches out from the cell body and it touches nearby cells, nearby neurons. So if axon of neuron A is near enough to excite its neighbor, neuron B, and he continues to tickle his neighbor, and each time he tickles his neighbor, it causes the neighbor neuron to fire. If that happens, then there is some cell growth or metabolic change that takes place between the two cells that creates a more efficient connection between the two neurons that are firing. Okay, let's take a look at what he's talking about. So these are two neurons, and the primary one on the left, that's Hebb's neuron cell A. And all those things branching out from the body, those are called dendrites, except for the axon. The axon is the long one, and you have axons going from a cell body in your spinal cord, and that axon goes all the way up into your brain. So these axons are typically the long connections coming out of a neuron. Now, the cell B that he talked about was over on the right upper right corner. That would be the the connection to the other body. Now, the axon itself, the direction of firing goes from the neuron cell A to neuron cell B. And it goes on the axon. It doesn't come back. It's one directional. So it's firing from A to B. Now, B looks like A also. It has its body and it has an axon which goes off and connects to other neurons. So it excites another neuron. So you get these chains of neurons, and the input are these dendrites down back to cell A, all those little branches sticking out, those are dendrites, and energy is coming into that cell and exciting it. And as it gets excited, then it starts firing, and it fires into cell B. And how much firing it does is based on what's called the all or none law. If it fires at full strength, and then it goes into a rest. So if it fires at full strength. It's not a rheostat where you can turn up the volume or turn it down. It fires or it doesn't fire, all or none law. And with that firing, what changes the amount is the input. So if you get a lot of input in those dendrites coming into cell A, and that firing is constant off of a lot of other cells surrounding cell A, well, then cell A is going to start firing like a machine gun. But if there's not much energy coming into that cell, then suddenly it's putting like an old Model T Ford. So the amount of energy coming in will indicate how much and how often cell A will fire into cell B. So that's a lot of technological jargon, but that's basically underneath all of these various models, whether it be the somatic marker of Antonio Damasio, or hedonic tone by Victor S. Johnston, or emotive trace which is what I use. So that is what creates the intensity of the desire, the intensity of the need. It's all based on an energy level. It's, again, it's power that's underneath everything. Okay. Now, even though this shows Maslow's pecking order, you'll see that both of those diagonals created by the columns come down to a neutral area in the middle where we don't care, we ignore it, and there's no power involved with things of that nature. Power is only for things we want or things we avoid. Now, taking those two columns, this is basically expressing the same things, but instead of wedges, they are curved areas. And this curve I call the efficiency curve because evolution is forcing us to conserve energy. Energy is the most precious thing we have, and we don't want to waste energy. So evolution is forcing us to conserve it. Now, earlier I talked about the internal control system, the parasympathetic nervous system, as being rest and digest. And that's shown down in the diagram in the lower left-hand column in the gold area. And it's gold because it represents the somatic nervous system. And of course, the sympathetic nervous system, the external control system, frequently is associated with fight or flight. So that's shown up there on the right side near the top. But a positive example of the internal control system is joy, which is in the upper left area of the gold area. So that included too. And also for fight or flight, the worst case is what Skinner called uh, punishment. And if we're afraid of being punished, if fight or flight is not viable, then typically animals or humans, we cower, which is a low energy state. We don't try and do anything. Internally, we're probably shaking in our shoes, but that would be the other extreme on the external control system. Low energy, which would be cowering. All right, so back to making decisions. The idea of the efficiency curve is we don't want to use any more energy, any more resources than is necessary. So we're going to pay or use the amount of energy. It's called at and below. It's used in weather for pilots for the height of the clouds. And you may have high clouds and some middle clouds, some low clouds. And where's the ceiling? Where is the point where you can't see uh, below you? And that's called the ceiling. And it's being able where you can't see at or if you can see at or below that level, that's the ceiling. Well, here it's an emotional, it's an energy ceiling. And let me give you an example of that. So let's say you want to buy an auto and you only have $30,000 to spend for an auto. Oh, that's pretty good auto in today's world, but in the next century, the 22nd century, that you probably couldn't buy a skateboard for that. So, but for today's world, 30,000 for a new car. That's what you've got to spend. Well, that's your ceiling. And so you can spend that amount or less than that amount. So you're looking around and you're looking at various other automobiles. And these are the vehicles that you find. There's one that you're looking at for 30K, and that matches your ceiling. There's a nicer one for 60K and the luxurious one for 90K, 90,000. And boy, you would love that. Uh, and that 90,000 one, not only does it have all the normal automatic bells and whistles, but it's got a bar in the back. It's got a coffee maker. It's basically a bus, and you can sleep in it. You can drive everywhere. So that's the luxurious model. But you've only got 30,000. So comparing the 30,000 against the 60,000, well, 60,000 is above. So that won't work. So the competition, the coalition won't work. You've got to be at or below the 30,000. So what do you do? Well, what if you see a used model of the one that sells new for 60,000? What if you find a used model at 29,000? Now you can afford the used vehicle, but it's got all the bells and whistles of the 60,000 model. So that becomes viable, and there's a good chance that you'll do that. So that's how the system works. If you can find a better deal that's within your budget, that's the 30,000 blue line, then you'll do it. Or if you want one of those $30,000 cars because you want a new car, well, you'll do one of those. Now, if let's say you're on a TV game show and you win the bus and you win, and you say, no, I don't want the bus. I can't use the bus. Well, maybe you can't use the bus, but now you can turn around and sell that bus to somebody else. Since you got it for free, you could probably sell a $90,000 bus for 50,000 or maybe less. And suddenly you have 30,000. That's what your limit is. Plus now you have a $50,000 profit from the bus that you sold. And so now you can spend 80,000 on a new car. You can go ahead and buy that $60,000 car now. So these are various things that can happen. If you get a better deal, if you get a bargain, then that brings you back within your ceiling amount, suddenly you can buy things that have more bells and whistles. So basically, that's how decisions are working. We have our maximum, and the red and green curves symbolize the maximum of what we're looking at. All right, so that was just for an automobile. All right, again, that's an efficiency curve. And on the left, those are things we want, like we need food. And that's part of the internal control system, rest and digest. Then on the other side, the things that we don't want a bucket of swill. So that's what our consciousness deals with, is weighing the pros and cons of both, what to get, what we want, what we don't want. Seek the things we want, avoid the things we don't want. All right. So that's the external control system. And because of the want and don't want, it creates a scale. There's some things we want more than others, and some things we don't want more than others. All right. So this is that situation of our wants and our diswants or dislikes, whatever you want to call it, things we seek and things we avoid. Now let's change the orientation. So now we've got the same things, but they're just a different orientation. Okay. And on top, there's life, food. We need food and we want food. If you If you really need something, you're going to want it. And then we need resources, and then we want people in our lives, family, spouse, friends, and we want our confidence to go up, and we want to be special. We want to have something that makes us unique, a star. And then there are unfortunately things that we want to avoid. We don't want our star power to fade. We don't want to become a statistic. We don't want our confidence to go down. We don't want to be without people in our lives, and we need resources. We don't want to be poverty stricken. And finally, we don't want death. So this is the same pecking order that Maslow talked about. We want food, we don't want swill and death. And again, that area in the middle, that is stuff we want neither. I'm sorry, we neither want and we don't want. Uh, and a good example of the clouds in the sky, they're up at 20,000 feet. So what? You care about that? Even pilots don't care about cirrus at 20,000 feet. All right. So things that we neither want or don't want, we ignore. Good example. What did you have for lunch 9 years, 3 months, and 12 days ago? Are you going to remember that? maybe, maybe if you're like Charles Schultz of the cartoonist, apparently he always had a tuna sandwich for lunch. Maybe he could say 9 years ago, 3 months, 12 days ago, what did I have for lunch? It was a tuna sandwich. Well, maybe he could get away with that. But most of us, we have variety in our lives, so we won't remember. Same thing with our clothes. What color were your socks on March 3rd of 2002? Probably don't know if you were even wearing socks. Maybe you were, maybe you weren't. How about 2012 or even a couple of years ago, 2022? What color socks were you wearing? These are things we don't care about. So that's what's in the middle. All right. Emotionally, that would be what I call cruising speed. Uh, Somebody asks you how you feel. Well, I feel okay. I feel fine. So fine, okay. It's cruising speed. Have you ever felt better in your life? Yeah. Have you ever felt worse in your life? Yeah. So cruising speed is somewhere in the middle. You don't feel fantastic and you don't feel horrible. Uh, but it's how we approach life. And some people have a better attitude toward life than others, and they might feel better as a general rule. But the extremes of life, feeling incredibly ecstatic, or worse, the opposite, deathly terror, those tend to be few and far between. We live most of our life with emotions somewhere in the middle, in between. So right there in the smack dab in the middle where there's nothing of interest and nothing to fear, that would be classic cruising speed. Okay, I'm going to break here. This has been about an hour, and this will be the end of this this segment of the Rosetta Stone of Psychology series.